Two things. Not sure whether I should make this a prelude to the video, interjection within the video, or the addendum. Placement, right? Post-recording placement. I'll keep doing these because obviously there's things to account for after you watch what you recorded. It's just I never know in terms of what's a good flow, where exactly to stick this. I'll probably make it a prelude, but who the hell knows. I brought up two things in something that I've recorded and that I've watched and that is certainly worthy enough of an upload, but the examples I gave didn't really impress me. I just couldn't come up with better examples on the fly, and then they came to me as I was watching what I recorded. So before you watch what I recorded, you need to hear this, or smack in the middle of watching what I recorded if I turn this into an interjection, or maybe at the very end of it. I brought up the achievement gap within the video. Hell, I may make it the title. And here's a good way to think about what's wrong with achievement as discussed by very impressive intellectuals, from John McWhorter to Glenn Lowry, all the way to less impressive intellectuals like Ibram El-Kendi. They disagree on all sorts of things among themselves, but they never take it so far as to consider for a split second that achievement should be encouraged as a non-systemic thing, a non-institutional thing. Anytime these people are talking about one or another type of problem with one or another type of achievement gap, they're talking about achievement as something that is recognized by systemic forces. I didn't use good examples in my recorded bits that will follow this, or that's in between this. I didn't use good examples, but here's the ultimate example, and I think a lot of people will be able to identify with this. When were you most competitive in your own life? Let's say when you played sports as a kid. Most of us played sports as kids. Were you most competitive when you were on a sports team, when you played against a bunch of stranger kids from a different school, or when you were playing against your own friends? See, the only way that I might even briefly consider someone who would be more eager to compete against the other school, where you didn't know any of the damn kids from Adam or from Eve, if it was a co-ed type sports, but back in my day it wasn't co-ed, so I didn't know any of those kids from Adam. The kids I competed against when it was with a sort of schooled approach to competition, one school plays against the other. They still do that, so I don't know why I'm even explaining this. That's not a past phenomenon, that's very much still a current phenomenon. But I just never really got into it the way I got into competition in a non-officially scheduled manner. There was no school, there was no other kind of league. It was just us playing against each other. Because of course I would be more competitive in those domains, because I'm competing against individuals I know and I have a history with. And just speaking for myself, maybe you can't empathize with this or relate to this, but every single friend I had who I played sports with, they were more a frenemy than they were a friend. And so, to me, I knew very few kids who actually took the school competition, one school against the other, more seriously than they took competing against their own friends on their own accord, without any other external force recognizing that there was a competition going on. The only kids who didn't is kids who didn't really have frenemies, whose friends they were actually just on purely good terms with all the time. I wasn't like that. Had disagreement after disagreement with friends, or just things that I wanted to push, forms of discourse that I wanted to push that they didn't really take much of an interest in, and that kind of annoyed me about them. I certainly had a lot of things about me that annoyed them, and so we were always closer to frenemies. So then when we competed against each other on our own accord, no external force organizing it, that was when my competitive juices were flowing the most strongly. Not when I was competing against a bunch of kids who I didn't know from Adam. Now, the reason this ties into achievement is I probably lost more often when I was competing in those structured contexts. My school was very, near the bottom of the totem pole, and that never bothered me. School spirit be damned, that never bothered me. What did bother me is every time I would lose competing against the kids that I knew who were my frenemies/friends. Now, I build that into my theory of achievement. Did I underachieve from a, let's say, sports competition standpoint throughout my youth? Well, I underachieve if you just measure the results that were kept on the scoreboard within that structural school competing against school context. Okay, I underachieved in that sense, but I overachieved overall because what matters to me so much more, what matters right now, and mattered certainly back in my youth, is those very competitions that were unstructured, but nonetheless we kept our own scoreboard, just completely self-organized sports competitions, from tennis to hockey to basketball, other sports, where it's just us competing against each other. If it came to blood level intensity, right, it never happened within the structured context. It always happened within the unstructured context where you are familiar with your opponents. No system right now that discusses achievement, no form of discourse, no visible intellectual that discusses achievement even entertains my approach to it that I just described right now. If someone achieves or underachieves, it is always considered in these, the system has to keep the scoreboard. You don't keep your own scoreboard. You do it based on what is systemically recognized. And that's why the achievement gap discussion is hollow. And I wish I would have used that example in the recording that will follow now. The other example I failed to use, I talked about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And I should have really used the example of this current hell, the most over-discussed thing, I think, in my lifetime that I can remember, with the exception of the Trumpist phenomenon. Aside from the Trumpist phenomenon, what is the most over-discussed thing? I think it is, in fact, the pandemic, the coronavirus. People who never expressed the least bit of interest in epidemiology and offshooting into virology, immunology. I know people who are reading this and who seem highly interested in it, but I think it really is only something that seems that way, and they're doing it because everyone else, to be a proper sort of epistemic agent from March 2020 onwards, to be a fair-minded, rightly curious sort of epistemic agent, you have to be knee-deep into highly technical, medical papers, essays, blogs even, that go into this stuff. And I just think that the only reason people are doing it is because it's the thing that everyone has to talk about, or it's the way to stay informed. When really, the staying informed stuff, it just comes down to two things. Do you trust the institutions, or do you not trust them? If you trust them, you don't need to go knee-deep into this discourse. You can simply look at the takeaway. The only way you would not be content with the takeaway, which comes down to either you trust the medical experts or you distrust them / mistrust them because they've made mistakes, whichever side you take on that, really, you don't need to waste time with it. Because you're really not that interested in it. It just seems interesting because it is consequential. But the nuts and bolts of it do not intrinsically motivate you. What's intrinsically motivating you is either your safety or to look like you're the sort of person who wants to be into what everyone else is discussing. You don't want to seem oblivious to it. So it's a form of signaling, and the moment you are signaling, the reason you're really reading it is closer to extrinsic than intrinsic motivation. And yet person after person who tells me that they've read the latest update on how the vaccine is rolling out, or the ins and outs of what the vaccine is about, or just the virus itself. See, it clicked for me very early on. I was reading about the virus itself, and then it just clicked on me. I'm not intrinsically motivated by this. This is 100% extrinsic, and I'm just reading on it. This was just like back in March 2020. I was like, I'm really only reading about it now. I never cared about anything within epidemiology prior. I'm only doing it now because this is the thing everyone's discussing, and by discussing it myself, I'll be signaling that I'm into the thing that's currently very important right now. And I shouldn't care about that. It's very simple. You either come down on the side of broadly trusting the medical experts or broadly mistrusting / distrusting them. But the details of that whole thing are boring as hell. They were every bit as boring prior to the pandemic, and they should be every bit as boring now. The fact that a pandemic or scandemic, whichever you like, is happening right now should not alter your actual motivational profile, such that you're willing to drudge through a bunch of boring ass text about things that wouldn't have interested you, let's say, as late as December 2019. So just be a little more wary about what motivates you intrinsically and extrinsically. And if something's only motivating you extrinsically, think about whether you really need to know as much about it as you're forcing yourself to read. Because it could have to do with just standard social signaling and not you having a genuine quench for that sort of knowledge. All cards on table, I am not at all interested in anything epidemiological. And that ties into the video as you're going to see it. I just wish that I could have recalled these two examples within the recording itself. The achievement gap measured by what type of scoreboard for achievement? Is it structural? Does it have to be structural? If you're the sort of person who took more joy competing against your friends in unorganized contexts, you should right away raise a giant eyebrow when it comes to how this debate is held, even by the best individuals taking part in this debate. The people correcting, let's say, Ibram Kendi. People like McWhorter and Lowry, and so on and so forth. Because even they don't question the achievement gap. They don't question, they don't think about alternative approaches to achievement. Things that are not recognized by any sort of system, but that matter to you. And then the second thing I wish I would have used is the example of epidemiology and all these people who are wasting a bunch of time on it right now never really seeming to ask themselves, am I actually interested in this, or is this really boring me? It took me a very short time, probably less than a week, when I started reading about the really granular details of this to realize that I'm only doing it because it's the thing that everyone else is doing right now. And then I stopped doing it. And then I read about the political ramifications of it and the efficacy of lockdowns, which is different than the dry health debate. The debate about the health aspects is every bit as uninteresting to me now as it was pre-pandemic. And a lot more people need to think about it in those ways, because I don't want to see people wasting time reading about stuff that they're not intrinsically motivated by. And if you're extrinsically motivated by, you can read about it to an extent, but you shouldn't lose freaking hours of your life on a weekly basis reading about it, because it's not your alley. Okay, on with the video. Let's keep this short and sweet. 10 to 15 minute range, maybe, if I'm lucky. Maybe I will make it longer after I've said what I have to say camera style. In a screenshot style, I'll read out some statistics if I'm not feeling lazy after I do this bit. If I'm satisfied enough with this bit, I'll keep the stats for a separate day. So yes, I'll do away with my taboo against short videos in this one. Maybe not do away, but temporarily suspend my taboo against short videos. Because it's been a senseless taboo, as taboos tend to be, and it's one of those topics that doesn't deserve more than 15 minutes tops, because it's just so simple. The topic itself is not under-discussed by any means, but what I am about to propose seems to be, by all accounts, a proposal that I just don't see. But maybe I should do a Q&A quickly. How many of you are familiar with a public school system in any country that tailors the idea of what it means to improve education to the individual pupil's needs, often very unique idiosyncratic needs, as opposed to having a more top-down vision of what it means to improve education, getting the parents involved, getting better quality teachers, and thinking that those things will be more conducive to improving educational outcomes. Students are more or less fungible, according to those views of what it means to improve the education system. Students are, give or take for a few diverse cases that we need to segment into different classrooms, pupils with mental health problems, learning disabilities, things of that nature, dyslexia. You take care of those, segment them in their own uniquely stylized, let's say, setting. And then the rest of the students, a good 90-95% of students, they might as well just be fungible. As long as the teacher is of a superior quality, and as long as we put in more funding, most of which is just pay the teachers better, as long as we get the parents involved more, We're doing our job to improve educational outcomes and the quality of education. So everywhere I look, any country, that's pretty much the view. The view I just summarized, that is just about as creative as they get when it comes to their ideas, for lack of a better term, on how to improve education. I can't find exceptions to that rule. If you have found exceptions to that rule where they do a bottom-up approach, assessing each individual, I know it's very hard to do for a public school system. A public school system has to one or another extent, treat pupils as just interchangeable clumps. So I'm not denying the role funding plays. Funding can make a difference here. I'm just concerned in all the countries that I've studied or just glanced at, funding is pretty much for top-down methods of improvement, almost never bottom-up methods of improvement. If there's any examples to the contrary, I want to learn about those examples before talking about how frustrated I am that just about no one, well, literally no one, that I keep tabs on, has proposed what I'm about to propose. And it's doubly annoying because the achievement gap debate is just not going away. Part of me is tempted to just blame Ibram Kendi for the fact that this debate is not going away, but also two figures that I praised to high heavens last year, Glenn Lauer, John McWhorter. Their approach to the achievement gap, it's like the one thing they point out that's good is that we shouldn't have a blindingly grouped approach to this. So the idea that one ethnicity or racial category does worse than another in academic achievement, like they explain why this is not per se a problem, but then nonetheless there is still a lingering view that suggests even if we do a strict individuated approach, so if certain individuals achieve less academically than others, we can still talk about the achievement gap as a problem. And I'm not so sure. Not as long as the public school system looks the way it does, and as long as this pupils are more or less fungible problem remains intact. I've spoken before on a number of occasions about how my lack of achievement from a post-secondary credential standpoint is probably one of the best things that's happened to me. If I had invested some of my best years in round-the-clock studying, cramming, things of that nature, and it would have been round-the-clock for me because I'm not a speed reader, if I would have done that, whatever rewards it would have resulted in years down the line would not have compensated for the lost time in those critical stages. Critical stages is the wrong way to put it. But there's certain kinds of benefits you can have, positives you can achieve when you are an adolescent, perhaps early to mid-20s at the latest, that cannot be recaptured down the line. Even gurus who annoy me, spiritual gurus who annoy me, make a habit of making this point. Watts has made this point, Terence McKenna has made this point, and it's one of the few times when I'm listening to them and it's all kinds of gobbledygook, but then they talk about the ladder climbers and I'm like, oh, well there, you said something that I can pretty much empathize with 100%. That does not mean that impulse control is a non-factor. Impulse control matters, but not when it comes to cramming and pretty much sacrificing a huge chunk of your youth to achieve benefits down the line. Impulse control matters for stuff like, not losing your patience and assaulting someone when they really piss you off. So high and low time preferences should be something we pay attention to as low versus high impulse control. I'm not trying to neglect that these are relevant things, but they have been emphasized in academic contexts way too much, and it is assumed that if there's an achievement gap academically, those who find themselves on the outs when it comes to that gap are necessarily made worse off. And that's a problem, and it's just annoying that spiritual gurus are pretty much the only people that I see recognize that point. But assuming that I'm wrong on this, and any sort of achievement gap, when it is wide enough, if we have Group A achieve this much, Group B achieve not anywhere near that much, so we'll recognize right off the bat that, it could just be some sort of a random effect where it's not the system is not implicated in it. So even though you can identify people group-wise, the fact that certain groups are overrepresented, underrepresented, we're not going to do the proportional representation. We're going to strip that of this discussion and maintain the view that the achievement gap is a problem in a strict individual sense. So if there's too much of a disparity when it comes to how certain individuals fare versus others, that itself is a reason to rethink how we do education. Okay, so then you have your Ibram Kendis talk about the whole problem of standardized testing, the idea of liberal enlightenment style approach to education. There's something to that. Rote memory. I've known student after student who has aced tests. You asked them about the aced test that they aced just a mere few weeks later. They're not going to know anything because they just crammed everything into their heads. And so the idea that that does actually correlate to some sort of educational value, the ability to ace a test, that is a little too quick. Doesn't mean we should do away with standardized testing, but we shouldn't put too much stock in them, because so much of what is learned is forgotten not that long after the test is done. Robin Hanson has written about this at length, about how he got to where he was in his position, not because he enrolled in any sort of secondary institution of higher learning, post-secondary, but he just showed up. He wasn't enrolled, he simply showed up and smuggled his way into the good graces of the professor, and that's how he got a foot in the door, so to speak. So you can get ahead without being a good little puppy, a good little test taker, which for a lot of us who aren't speed readers means sacrificing a huge chunk of your time. But initially, when I talked about top-down versus bottom-up approach when it comes to reforming how we do education, what did I have in mind? And what do I have in mind when I talk about each pupil's individual interests? It's stuff that correlates with learning styles. On the one hand, I don't know of anyone who is just a pure autodidact versus a pure non-autodidact. So these terms can get a little oversimplistic. But nonetheless, each and every one of us is on a spectrum. We all fall on a spectrum where if you have the full-blown autodidact at a 10 and the full-blown non-autodidact at a 1, if I had to guess where I'm at an 8. So for the most part, when I'm left to my own devices, I can learn what I need to. I don't need to be spoon-fed by the performance of the professor slash teacher slash whoever it is that is paid to perform for me, to make me learn better. Not all the time, but I would give myself a rating of 8 out of 10. Was I ever screened by any institution of learning? I went to 5 different ones. Changed schools 3 times in elementary school, changed school twice in high school. Well, no, I went to 5, so I changed school 3 times in elementary school, once in high school, equaling to 5 schools. These were fairly different schools in fairly different regions. Did any of them take any sort of measure to check what would be the most conducive spectrum, autodidact to non-autodidact learning style for me? No. I would venture that you're not any different than me in that respect. Do you believe this is not a problem? Just show of hands in the comment section. That none of us are vetted and screened to see where exactly we fall on this spectrum of autodidact to non-autodidact. The further away from non-autodidact and the closer we fall to full-blown autodidact, the more time we should be afforded to learn at our own pace and to be left to our own devices when it comes to our learning. It doesn't have to take effect right off the bat, but I would say by grade 5, 6, certainly by 7, certainly by high school. Those of us who have been screened and who have been given a grade, the methods for this have to be careful. I agree, you can't just give a one-off test. It has to be a series of tests. Certainly by age 13, 14, those who score at a 10 out of 10 when it comes to getting that title of full-blown autodidact, they have no business being regimented in the school system, being told when to go to sleep, when to wake up, how long to stay in the school, who to pay attention to at particular times of the day, to be physically present in a sense. Maybe this will be a minority of the students. Fair enough. But that's why it matters. The spectrum view matters. If you're an 8 out of 10, okay, some amount of time, you'll end up going to, let's say, high school the whole way through. Your K through 12 will, to some level, still consist of being physically present. So this does get into the bricks versus clicks debate. The clicks side of things is going to be more conducive the more closer you score to the full-blown autodidact end of the spectrum. Whereas the bricks side, physically attending, needing to be spoon-fed by the performance teacher, that's going to be more your jam the closer you score to 1, which is the full-blown non-autodidact, if we just do a simple 1 through 10 spectrum view. So yeah, just to stress, I'm not proposing any sort of alternative educational reality where there's these autodidacts and then there's these non-autodidacts, and then we do a nice clean split. Or these kids stay home the whole way through and these kids keep going to school the way they've always been going the whole way through. That's not going to do many people much good, because most people are a mix of the two things. Just as they're a mix of the two things when it comes to being left-brained versus right-brained, which ties into intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. People often talk about left-brained versus right-brained in terms of learning styles, and yeah, there is something to that, but it also gets at what you are intrinsically motivated by versus extrinsically motivated by. So I might be extrinsically motivated to learn math, because math is a means to some sort of end. Certainly in philosophy, when you get into symbolic logic, it's very hard to understand, and the more mathematically versed you are, the easier it is to understand a philosophical paper that utilizes symbolic logic to a great extent. So even though I can safely say I have no intrinsic passion for mathematics, I have had to sort of twist my own arm to learn it, because that gets you one step closer to learning symbolic logic, or just logic proper, which makes it easier to understand the average advanced level philosophical paper that relies sometimes very heavily on deep uses of symbolic logic to get the concepts across a lot quicker. So that's just one example why I, even though I have no inherent interest in mathematics, have sort of fallen back into trying to get an advanced appreciation and understanding of it. There can be many such examples, and this ties into left-brained versus right-brained. Some people, though they are not entirely left or right-brained at the level of learning ability, they are nonetheless entirely left-brained or right-brained when it comes to what they are intrinsically motivated by, what subjects they want to fixate on versus entirely ignore. So maybe there's a few people who are smack in the middle. They can oddly enjoy a great poem, just as they can try to solve the next big mathematical proof. Maybe there's people like that. I haven't met many of them. The people that I've met, when it comes to what they're intrinsically motivated by, not their learning styles, but intrinsic motivation, it really is almost a perfect binary. So that's yet another screening process that people need to pay attention to. Not just autodidact versus non-autodidact, that's always going to be more of a spectrum, but perhaps when it comes to intrinsic motivation, you can have everyone learn reading, writing, arithmetic, but really, that really peters out at about age 10 onwards. You don't need to keep teaching just this vast array of topics in equal proportion to each student. Here, the electives kicked in grade 11 and 12 in high school. But even the electives thing is a problem, because how well acquainted are any of us going to be about where exactly we fall on that left to right brain spectrum when it comes to intrinsic motivation? We may just guess what we want to. I've known a number of people who just took the course that they felt that they would do best at, even though they weren't necessarily intrinsically passionate about it. But they just figured, I will elect course X because course X just happens to be the sort of thing that I'm good at, even though it kind of bores me. So I don't mean to imply that from grade 10 onwards, from age 10 onwards, we just make everyone's course load an entirely elective affair. but we do test people to see exactly, precisely what they are intrinsically motivated by, and we assign them that sort of course load. And then we, obviously it's going to come at the expense of less emphasis on all the other stuff. So if someone like me has no inherent passion for mathematics, and also has no inherent passion for reading philosophical papers that utilize symbolic logic, then there's really no acceptable defense for why you would have them keep learning mathematics all throughout high school. And especially when you reconsider the point that, like, people who used to ace math tests, really, I can't think of a single one. If you just have them retake the math test a month later, it was just in one ear, out the other. In one brain cell, out the other. They crammed, they memorized it, but then they forgot it. So there's no lasting educational value for it. And it's just infuriating. There's just all this talk about the achievement gap. There's all this talk about reforming education. And in so many different ways, it overlooks things that are so simple that I don't see how anyone can really... People write books about education, and none of this is mentioned in the books. It's unacceptable. And maybe I'm being too nice by saying that everyone has the exact same course load up until grade 5. Maybe it can kick in as early as grade 3. Maybe these screenings about left versus right-brained learning styles as well as motivational profiles, maybe they should kick in much earlier. Everyone should learn their reading, their writing, their basic arithmetic, certain scientific things, I guess, but in my experience, people who did great in science also forgot about most of the things that they did great in. I know a person who was a straight A honor roll and ended up being a creationist, so much for their knowledge of science when you're going to repress it in other contexts. But all of that is just a practical proposal. I have a radical proposal. Maybe it doesn't really matter. The difference is moot, since no one's going to implement even my practical proposal, which I think is far more safe. The slightly more dangerous one, or maybe plenty more dangerous one, is the one that just notices how many dormant frustrations we have. It's something that I've only in a slow burn way started noticing about myself. Frustrations that wouldn't have been dormant had I not been psychologically catapulted into the schooling system at the age of 5/6. Counting kind of the preschool thing as a catapult, which maybe that's not fair. Maybe I should just start from grade 1, which is Eastern Europe. We didn't have kindergarten, we just started grade 1. So in my case, I was psychologically catapulted into finding it perfectly normal to attend schooling 5 days a week, sometimes 6. We had the occasional working Saturday. And I didn't really appreciate until fairly recently, a few years back, just how that normalization, contrived normalization, it's compulsory schooling. If there was anything organic about it, parents wouldn't get into all kinds of legal trouble for letting their kids stay out of school without supplementing it with homeschooling. The normalization of that, what it does to us, making it normal to show up to a given place very early in the morning, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. If you're from Eastern Europe, you'll know what I'm talking about, the phenomenon of working Saturdays, but across the West, 5 days a week, at such an early age. Well, it probably means that once you transition out of school to the workforce, you continue giving yourself flack for all sorts of things that, as an adult, you really have no business giving yourself flack for. So I can't tell you how many times, this is from maybe 5 years ago onwards and before. So not recently. I'm much more analytical now, and I catch myself giving myself grief. But if we're talking about 5 years ago and before, during my work life, I would give myself all kinds of grief, all kinds of self-blame. I'd come home from work, 8 hours would fly by. Next thing I know, it's about 6 hours till I got to wake up and start getting ready for work again. That 6 hours turns into 5 turns into 4. I haven't really made an effort to go to sleep. All kinds of self-blame for not having made that effort. But really, the reasoning for it comes down to just I'm doing something and time is just flashing by like lightning. And then it's like 4 hours and I'm really beating myself up. How irresponsible of me. Now, would that be, even for a split second, something that I would have kicked myself for had this normalization of the ultimate regiment not kicked in at such an early age for us through the schooling system, compulsory schooling? The idea that you gotta sleep for 5 days a week at a certain time so you can wake up and be fresh, relatively fresh, to attend schools 5 days out of the week. And if you don't do that, either your parents are doing something wrong or you're doing something wrong if you have more self-determination over your life. I often think about this in the context of the unexamined life is not worth living, and quotes like that. And an adjacent quote that I've never heard anyone say, but that is really a contender that can give that quote a run for its money, is the view that the scheduled life is not worth living. Or let's say the excessively scheduled life. And yeah, 5 days out of the week, if you gotta not only surrender to the view that you ought to be at a certain place between 9 to 5, let's say, for the workaday chump, that doesn't just affect the 9 to 5, realistically. That also affects, from a guilt trip standpoint, it affects you if you're not asleep by, let's say, 1 a.m. If you're awake past 1 a.m., you're going to be kicking yourself. And that only makes sense, and it only makes sense to view what I'm talking about now as whining, is because you were just catapulted into that as a normalized affair when you had no chance to think about it critically. None of us had a chance to think about it critically, so much so that this only became non-dormant for me over the last few years. For years I was kicking myself. And so not only do we surrender to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, but then what we do on our own, quote-unquote, our own time, it's not going to be our own time. Of course, you can go consecutive shifts without sleep, consecutive school days without sleep, but man, you get less than 4 hours of sleep, that waking up process, it's going to be far worse. And realistically, sometimes, even if I get enough sleep, even if I get more than 6 hours of sleep, but it's like day number 5 for me, where I'm just 1 day away from my weekend. So I'm underslept just because it's been already 4 days of work. Just the idea that hitting snooze is something that's unacceptable. At most you can hit it once. And if you hit it once, that second snooze kicks in, then you gotta rush. And that waking up process, where you're kind of having to rush your way through being half asleep, and it's suffering. I'm not going to shy away from using the word suffering. We're all trained to view our suffering as something that you just shut the fuck up about and you don't complain about much. You complain to yourself in your brain as it's happening. It's like, God, I wish I could just stay in bed. But you don't make any sort of a social issue out of it. No, you just suck it up. You never convinced me that that would be normalized had it not been for compulsory schooling kicking in and taking control of our minds as to what's normal that early on, because before we had a chance to fend for ourselves. The scheduled life may well not be worth living when it is excessively scheduled. And people are victims of it. People who are retired cops who I've had some dealings with talking about how they don't know what to do with themselves now that they're retired. That is a kind of abuse. Intellectually curious people who are ex-cops, who are now retired, despite their intellectual curiosity and the world of information at their fingertips, complain about not knowing what to do with themselves. It really is some mixture of absurd and repugnant, that reality for so many people, smart people. I don't believe for a second that nearly as many people would have been that way had this normalization not kicked in so early on. Now, does it need to? Separate questions. I've just identified the costs of it. There may well be enough benefits to compensate for the costs, but I'm skeptical. And the reason I stuck with the first practical proposal
It doesn't really matter why, whether it's practical, it's not going to get implemented, whether it's my practical proposal or this radical one that I'm hammering on right now. I just know that for a long time I had these dormant frustrations that I dare not articulate, certainly even to myself, but certainly not in a video, because it's just going to be construed as whining. If this video had tens of thousands of views, there'd be a steady stream of commenters who are saying, wait, you're complaining publicly about how much it sucks to wake up and force yourself to get out of bed? You're using the word, you dare use the word suffering to describe it? Yeah, I dare use the word suffering. I do not shy away from it. It is the most steady stream of suffering in my life. And that's why I'm not only making an effort to go down to 4 days, which I've largely succeeded, I'm going to, well before the retirement age, make an even greater effort to go down to 3 days. And the only problem with that is not like I'm wronging myself. It's like only as I'll be a less effective altruist the lower of an income that I have. So I get that angle, but I'm just talking about from a pure prudence standpoint. The idea that the working life is there's just something about the nature of work that is irreplaceable. It's very much replaceable if you just know how to cultivate a hobby or set of hobbies which you are intrinsically motivated by. Work as paid employment has to be means-based. So it has to be something that, okay, it's an external motivation. But so many people in the philosophy of work, there's a specific domain of philosophy, the philosophy of work, and they just assume that it maps onto intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic, and it's the biggest mistake that I see otherwise sound thinking individuals fall into. A lot of them. And it results in a specific ism called workism. It's like, yeah, whatever is a downside of work is more than compensated by the upsides of work for the individual. Not some macro level analysis, but no, for each individual, the fact that we spend 4 or 5 decades working, that is good for us, because we wouldn't know what to do with ourselves had it not been for that. Peterson made the same point. I should respond to it. His conversation with Michael Shermer, insufferable in a few parts. I need to do a separate response to that. But just like, yeah, there's just people who, they just need to serve their communities. They can serve their communities even if UBI is implemented. It's like this was supposed to be a counterpoint to UBI. It's like work will not become prohibited if UBI is implemented. If we give a chance to people to, let's say, retire at 45 as opposed to 65, because let's say UBI as a trial run kicks in for individuals 45 and over who have given 2.5 decades already of their life to full-time employment. But see, the conflation of employment versus fulfilling hobbies is one of the most insidious things that I see public intellectuals either fail to devote enough attention to if they don't believe it, or if they are believing in it, how can they possibly believe it in the first place? It is too absurd. It's too easy to see that it's a spurious view. And yet there's just so few people who are mounting an attack against it. And then especially when we consider that whether you cultivate a marketable or non-marketable skill is just so down to circumstances that you yourself have no control over. How many times have we seen a genius who invented something, or some other kind of captain of industry, or someone whose skills are really in, they weren't in when they started honing those skills, but then something turned, usually something in the way of technology. And then we ask those people, what would you be doing if you hadn't been doing this? And they look and they stare almost blankly at the person who asked them the question. They say, I have no idea what I'd be doing. This is the only thing I've ever been good at. Hell, I just might be one of those panhandlers if I didn't fall into this. So on top of everything else, the pure luck aspect, determining whether the skills that you've honed are marketable versus non-marketable, that itself takes away any sort of honor-based spin on the idea that paid employment is superior to fulfilling hobbies, superior for the individual being paid. Whether your skills are marketable or not, there's so many circumstantial factors that can make that change overnight. The technological revolution has shown that beyond any measure of doubt.
Okay, so critical pedagogy, just going to put the finishing touches on this. Critical pedagogy is what I had in mind the last time when I brought up the Brahm X Kendi, not L Kendi, but X Kendi. I'll have to correct that. A lot of them have X now as a, yeah, not their real names. They're academic gimmick names. In his case, I got it wrong. It's X Kendi. But yeah, he's pushing critical pedagogy, which I didn't name in the earlier segments, but that's what I had in mind, the sort of antidote to liberal Enlightenment style approaches to education. So here's one line of attack. It's the charter schools that is at least a line of attack against the status quo approach to education. It's been implemented in certain places. This video by Sprouts presents a flattering case of the New Orleans school experiment by way of charter schools. But I've also seen the headlines of certain pieces that say it's a mixed bag. There's access problems, there's equity problems, but I'll let people judge that. But the point is, it's a polar opposite from the critical pedagogy approach. Charter schools, it's more about school choice. And unfortunately, the reason I wouldn't say it's the optimal solution is because, well, it's mostly the choice of the parents, and the kid, it's kind of phrased in the description that the kid and the parent get to choose, but in practice, it's really the parents who get to choose. So it does it does concern itself more with school choice than the status quo approaches. But I just fear that a lot of the weight of the choice is placed in the parents' hands, which again, that's practically necessary. But if we want to take my radical-minded approach, maybe that's not quite sufficient either. But these are the two approaches talked about most often: charter schools, and now a complete opposite is this critical pedagogy. And then you see some articles affiliated with it. Anti-oppressive education encompasses multiple approaches to learning that actively challenge forms of oppression. So nothing in here about autodidacts. Abolitionist training refers to practices and approaches to teaching that focus on restoring humanity for all children in schools. It's not about restoring humanity. It's about filtering who is what type of learner and trying to be as segmenting as possible based on that data. And I don't think we screen kids that way. Restoring humanity. We don't deprive pupils of humanity by not screening them, but we deprive them of an ideal environment suitable for them. And you can't believe how many different wings this critical pedagogy has. Let's see this other one. Anti-bias curriculum, an activist approach to educational curricula which attempts to challenge prejudices such as racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, weightism, homophobia, classism, colorism, heightism, handism. Jeez, I've never even heard of handism. Religious discrimination and other forms of kyriarchy. I probably mispronounced it. But nothing in here about what is going to be advantageous to people who are closer to the 10 out of 10 on the autodidact spectrum. Just all of this, but nothing in here that I've seen. Humanitarian education, various social topics from a humanitarian perspective. Where's the love for the autodidacts? I don't see it. Frustrating as hell. And there's the big challenges to the status quo. You got your critical pedagogy, and you got your charter schools, which is closer to my ideal, but nowhere close enough. And if you want, I'll link this video. It paints a pretty picture of what happened to New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina and following the reforms that had to be made because the hurricane just devastated the environments where the status quo had settled in. So this gets a soft recommendation, and this and all of these affiliated articles just gets a big fuck you from me for encompassing all sorts of, let's say, stigmatized groups without, and in any of these articles, bringing up the stigmatized autodidact.
who may not be a 10 out of 10 in terms of their strength for how autodidactic they are, but they're close to it. And these people really think that they're thinking outside the box, but really they're just fighting battles of the past. They're fighting ghosts. They just refuse to see how they're lost in history, and there's current status quos that need to be fought in the way of the autodidact, and they're just distracting away from it. It pisses me off. So, that's it.